This story isn't inspired by a Hollywood script, it's based on a real incident that took place in the United States. It begins on May 15, 2001, at a railroad yard in Ohio, where a train engineer named Walter Higgins made a single mistake, one that would soon spiral into a nightmare. While switching rail cars, Walter noticed that the track alignment ahead wasn't set correctly. Wanting to save time, he decided not to bring the train to a complete stop. Instead, he left it rolling slowly in low gear, ignored standard safety procedures, and jumped out of the cab so he could manually switch the tracks himself. Walter was convinced he could handle everything before anything went wrong. But in that very moment, he made the mistake that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As he climbed out of the cab, he placed the locomotive in what he believed was the sliding position. What he didn't realize was that the gear had never fully engaged. The instant Walter hit the ground, the gear slipped into full forward mode. Train 777, which had been moving at a slow crawl just moments earlier, suddenly lurched to life like a sleeping beast awakened. Its speed began climbing steadily. Walter wasn't even halfway to the track switch before the locomotive shot past him. That was the moment the real disaster began. He sprinted toward the switch lever and managed to throw it, but by then it was already too late. The meaning was terrifyingly clear. Train 777 was now racing down the main line with no engineer on board, accelerating faster with every passing second. Panicked, Walter gave everything he had, chasing after the runaway locomotive. Somehow he managed to grab one of the side handrails. This was his last and best chance to climb aboard, but luck wasn't on his side. His lungs burned, his grip weakened, and he slipped, crashing hard onto the ground. Now the situation was completely out of control. The massive steel freight train, pulling 29 rail cars and weighing nearly 13,000 tons, was charging down the tracks like a runaway monster. With every second it picked up more speed, tearing down the railway and barreling past everything in its path. The most shocking part? Walter still had no idea just how catastrophic the situation had become. He rushed straight to the dispatch office and reported everything to his supervisor. "Sir, I left the train in sliding gear. It shouldn't have been able to accelerate like this." He had no idea that this tiny mistake was about to become one of the most dangerous runaway train incidents in American history.
"How fast is it going?" his supervisor asked. "Not more than 20 kilometers an hour, sir," Walter replied. Hearing that, the supervisor didn't think the situation was particularly serious. After giving Walter a brief lecture, he simply dispatched a crew to catch up with the train. But as they headed out, reality hit them hard. The runaway locomotive was still accelerating, and their vehicle couldn't keep up. They chased it for miles, but there was no sign of train 777 anywhere. Only then did everyone realize just how badly things had gone wrong. But the most terrifying news was still to come. The same main line the runaway train was racing down was also carrying a tourist passenger train headed in the opposite direction. On board were 150 children. The two trains were now on a direct collision course. At the speed train 777 was traveling, there wasn't enough time to evacuate the passengers. If nothing was done, a catastrophic head-on collision was only moments away. The dispatch center erupted into chaos. The supervisor immediately called the engineer of the passenger train. "Switch to the alternate track right now," he shouted. The moment he hung up, the situation became even more critical. Train 777 was now tearing down the tracks at more than 100 kilometers per hour, and the collision was only seconds away. Then, at the very last possible moment, the veteran engineer of the passenger train performed a remarkable maneuver. With flawless timing, he diverted his train onto a different track. Only seconds later, the two trains thundered past each other. The children inside the tourist train clapped and cheered, completely unaware that the locomotive they had just passed wasn't being driven by anyone at all. They had unknowingly come within seconds of death. Within hours, news of the runaway train spread across Ohio like wildfire. Television stations interrupted their regular programming with breaking news, and the incident quickly reached the highest levels of the railroad company. Someone in the dispatch center suggested derailing the train immediately. Management refused. This wasn't an ordinary freight train. It was carrying highly dangerous cargo.
The train was hauling nearly 200 tons of diesel fuel, more than 120 tons of highly flammable materials, and several cars loaded with toxic chemicals. Derailing it at that speed would almost certainly trigger a massive explosion, and if those hazardous chemicals leaked, the damage wouldn't be limited to the railroad. Nearby towns could be contaminated, thousands of lives put at risk, and the surrounding environment devastated. This was no longer just about stopping a runaway train. It had become a race to save an entire region. If the train crashed, the railroad company could face more than $100 million in environmental penalties alone, not to mention the collapse of its stock price and the enormous financial fallout that would follow. The executives weren't willing to accept that kind of loss without exhausting every possible option. An emergency meeting was called immediately. Within minutes, they came up with an incredibly dangerous plan. The idea was to send another locomotive onto the same track at a slower speed, allowing the runaway train 777 to catch up and make contact from behind. The impact, they hoped, would absorb some of the momentum and gradually reduce its speed. It was an extremely risky strategy, a mission that bordered on suicide. The job was assigned to a seasoned veteran engineer named Gerald Mitchell. Gerald understood that accepting the mission could cost him his life. Even so, he climbed into the locomotive without hesitation. After a series of violent impacts, the plan finally seemed to be working. The speed of train 777, which had been well over 100 kilometers per hour, gradually dropped to around 60 kilometers per hour. But the danger was far from over. Now it was time for the second phase of the operation. A helicopter was dispatched to lower another engineer onto the moving locomotive so he could climb into the cab and regain control. But the moment he stepped onto the engine, another powerful jolt slammed the two locomotives together. The impact was so violent that it threw him into the air. He was hurled off the train and crashed to the ground, unconscious. The second phase of the mission had failed completely. But Gerald Mitchell wasn't the kind of man who gave up. In the distance, he spotted a maintenance siding. Relying on decades of railroad experience, he made one final gamble. If he could somehow pull train 777 onto the side track, he could clear the main line and reduce the risk of a catastrophic disaster. Unfortunately, even though the runaway train had slowed down somewhat, its enormous weight was still far beyond what Gerald's single locomotive could handle. The attempt failed. Worse still, Gerald's locomotive lost control, overturned, and crashed. The man who was only 2 months away from retirement gave his life doing his duty. Meanwhile, within minutes, it was back above 100 kilometers per hour, charging down the tracks like an unstoppable force. The entire operation ended in disaster.
After the failed operation, the railroad company's management decided they couldn't afford to take any more risks. Reluctantly, they returned to the original plan. Near a small town farther down the line, crews began installing a derailment device, hoping it would force the runaway train off the tracks before it reached a populated area. Police moved into action immediately. Residents living nearby were evacuated to safety, while news helicopters and television crews followed the runaway train live from the air. Everything was in place. The next few minutes would determine whether this ended with the destruction of the runaway locomotive or one of the worst rail disasters in American history. All they could do now was wait for train 777 to reach the derailment point. But at that exact moment, another danger appeared. An empty freight train was approaching from the opposite direction. There were only 2 people aboard. One was a highly experienced engineer, Daniel Cooper. The other was Ethan Wolfe, a young railroad employee on his very first day on the job. By the time they received word about the runaway train, less than 10 kilometers separated the 2 locomotives. Fortunately, there was a siding between them. Daniel immediately pushed the throttle forward. Within moments, the switch came into view. But there was no time to celebrate. Straight ahead, they could already see the massive steel monster racing toward them. Without wasting a second, Daniel steered his train onto the sidetrack at the very last moment, saving the locomotive. But their freight train was too long. The final rail car hadn't completely cleared the main line. A split second later, train 777 slammed into it. The last car exploded into twisted steel and flying debris. After the violent impact, everything felt eerily silent. Daniel looked back. The last freight car had been completely destroyed. Then an idea flashed through his mind. It was dangerous, maybe even insane, but it just might work. "We leave the rail cars here," Daniel said without hesitation. "Take only the locomotive. We'll chase that train." His plan was simple. Catch up to train 777, couple their locomotive to the rear of the runaway train, and use the engine's pulling power, like a massive tug of war, to slow it down. It was an incredibly dangerous mission. When company executives heard the proposal, they rejected it immediately. "The derailment device is already in place. There's no reason for you two to play heroes." But Daniel Cooper wasn't about to back down. "If that derailment fails, an entire town could be destroyed. We have to stop that train before it gets there." And with those words, the story entered its most dangerous chapter. Daniel knew the derailment device was never going to be enough. At the speed and weight train 777 was carrying, there was a very real chance it would blast straight through it. This wasn't about being a hero. It was about preventing a disaster on a scale no one could imagine. If the train derailed near the city ahead, the explosion and chemical spill could devastate the entire area. Daniel had barely finished speaking when the runaway locomotive reached the derailment point. And exactly as he had warned, the device failed. It couldn't stop train 777. Now, the only hope left rested with Daniel and Ethan and the single locomotive they were riding. Daniel pushed his engine to its limit and quickly closed the gap. The most dangerous part of the mission was about to begin. They had to couple their locomotive to the rear of the runaway train while both trains were moving. Daniel carefully matched the runaway train's speed while Ethan guided him from the rear platform. Their first attempt failed completely. The impact shattered the last hopper car, sending rocks flying in every direction. Dust and debris filled the air, making it almost impossible to breathe. Still, neither of them gave up. They lined up for another try. This time, luck was on their side. The two locomotives finally connected. But then Ethan noticed something terrifying. The coupler hadn't locked completely. One hard jolt and the connection would snap apart. Without hesitating for even a second, Ethan risked his life. As rocks continued flying around him, he crouched down beside the moving coupler and kicked the locking mechanism with all his strength. The lock slammed into place. It worked. But in that same instant, his foot became trapped inside the coupler. A surge of pain shot through his leg. he lost his balance.
Inside the control center, Ethan's wife watched in horror. Her heart nearly stopped. Then, a miracle. A few agonizing seconds later, Ethan reappeared. Somehow, he had managed to grab onto a handrail before falling beneath the train. Bruised, injured, and limping badly, he pulled himself back onto the rail car. Tears of relief filled his wife's eyes. But the danger was far from over. The runaway train was still racing along at nearly 120 kilometers per hour, and it was now less than 10 kilometers from the next city. The most terrifying obstacle lay just ahead. At the entrance to the city was a sharp curve that could only be taken safely at 40 kilometers per hour or less. If the train entered that curve any faster, it would almost certainly derail. Even worse, large fuel storage tanks sat directly below the bend. If the train overturned there, the resulting explosion would be beyond imagination. Daniel didn't hesitate. He pushed his locomotive to its absolute limit, pulling against the runaway train with everything the engine had, like a desperate tug of war. But one locomotive simply wasn't powerful enough to overcome the weight of 30 fully loaded rail cars. The wheels spun furiously. Sparks erupted from the steel rails. Then Ethan had one final idea. "If we manually apply the brakes on every rail car," he shouted, "we might be able to slow it down." But Ethan was badly injured. There was only one person who could do it: Daniel Cooper. Without a second thought, Daniel climbed onto the moving train. One by one, he made his way across the rail cars, manually setting the handbrakes. The first car, then the second, then the third. With every brake he engaged, the runaway train lost a little more speed. After several exhausting minutes, their efforts finally paid off. The train had slowed significantly, but it still wasn't slow enough to make the curve safely. Now there was nothing left to do. The curve was directly ahead. Everyone could only hope for a miracle. The locomotive leaned violently as it entered the bend. Every person watching held their breath. For one terrifying moment, it looked as though the train was about to roll over, but somehow, it stayed on the tracks.
Against all odds, Train 777 made it through the curve. For a brief moment, it seemed the worst was finally behind them. Then disaster threatened once again. The brakes had overheated. One by one, the brake discs failed, and the entire braking system gave out. The runaway train began accelerating all over again. Daniel immediately sprinted toward the lead locomotive. If he could just reach the cab, he might finally be able to bring the train to a complete stop. But halfway there, he was forced to stop. The gap between two rail cars was simply too wide. There was no way to jump across it. For a moment, it seemed there was no way forward. Then, in the middle of that life or death moment, a pickup truck pulled up alongside the speeding train. "Ethan, jump!" Daniel shouted. Without a moment's hesitation, Ethan leapt from the moving train and landed safely in the bed of the pickup. Now there was only one final gamble left. Somehow, Daniel managed to make his way to the lead locomotive. Everyone watching from the control center sat frozen, their hearts pounding as they stared at the monitors. Every second felt like an eternity. Gathering every ounce of courage he had left, Daniel waited for the perfect moment. Then he made his move. In a matter of seconds, everything changed. He climbed into the cab of the runaway locomotive and immediately shut down the throttle, bringing the massive train under control. At last, the steel monster that had been racing uncontrollably down the main line for more than 2 hours finally came to a stop. An entire region was spared from what could have become one of the worst rail disasters in American history. And that is where this incredible true story comes to an end.